Hey guys, tonight we journey back to a time of grandeur, treachery, and decadence. The final days of King Henry VIII. The English monarch who ruled for over 4 decades. Imagine walking through the shadowed corridors of his court, a realm steeped in ambition, backstabbing, and grandiose ambitions. Now picture a man once larger than life, slowly deteriorating before his kingdom. His once commanding presence now riddled with physical afflictions, both from his failing health and the weight of his decisions. The story we're about to explore unfolds in a palace that once echoed with the laughter of grand feasts, now silenced by the king's looming death. You probably won't survive this historical journey without hearing a few wails from the court, both literal and figurative. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know where you're listening from and what time it is where you are, so we can all feel like we're part of the same evening journey. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. In Henry's final years, his body was no longer the image of power. King Henry VIII in his youth was a robust, athletic figure, a symbol of strength and vitality. By his last days, however, he had transformed into something entirely different. His body, once a proud display of regal strength, was now riddled with diseases and deformities. His obesity had reached extreme levels. His legs were so swollen and painful that he could no longer ride horseback or even stand for long periods. His once majestic face, known for its sharp features and commanding presence, was now bloated, covered in sores. The king who had once captivated all of England with his charisma now looked like a prisoner to his own body. His poor health had become a constant topic of conversation among those closest to him. His courtiers, his ministers, and his wives. Some believed his maladies were the result of his lifestyle overindulgence in food, alcohol, and pleasure. Others whispered of darker causes, perhaps the syphilis he had contracted in his youth, or maybe even a genetic predisposition that had caught up with him. Historians still argue whether his physical decline had a direct impact on his mental state. Was he in fact becoming mad in his later years, or was his behavior simply a reflection of the stresses of power and the toll of years of constant political maneuvering? Whatever the case, Henry VIII's court became increasingly volatile as his health declined. With the king's deterioration came a growing sense of urgency within his court, as the man who once ruled with an iron fist now seemed to be crumbling. Those around him began to wonder who would inherit the throne, and more importantly, who would hold the real power in England once Henry was gone. The court was filled with ambitious figures, each hoping to secure their place in history, no matter the cost. Henry's health, it seemed, had become just as much a battleground as the battlefield. As the king's health continued to worsen, the once vibrant court of Henry VIII grew quieter, filled with whispers and anxieties about the future. His body may have been failing him, but his mind, well, that's a bit more complicated. For years, Henry had been known for his sharp intellect, his keen understanding of politics, and his ability to inspire loyalty and fear in equal measure. But as his illnesses intensified, so too did his erratic behavior. And while he might have been in constant pain, some say the greater anguish came from his inability to control the kingdom the way he once did. The king's obsession with his appearance was one of the more fascinating aspects of his decline. Once a man who enjoyed the admiration of both men and women alike, Henry now saw his reflection with growing dissatisfaction. His face was swollen, his body burdened by excess weight, and his self-esteem faltering with each passing day. It wasn't just his health that was decaying. His once proud personality seemed to crumble beneath the weight of his insecurities. The king's declining state wasn't just about physical appearance, though. There was a deeper issue at play. His political savvy seemed to wither just as quickly as his body. His reign had been marked by extreme decisions, many of them self-serving, yet essential to the development of the English monarchy as we know it today. His breaking with the Catholic Church to establish the Church of England and his numerous marriages were examples of his far-reaching influence. But now, in his final years, the decisions that were once bold and powerful were becoming erratic, bordering on madness. Historians still argue whether Henry VIII's mental state contributed to the turbulence of his final years. Was his temper fueled by the agony of his many ailments, or was he simply a ruler who had become addicted to power, desperate to hold on to it no matter the cost? Some speculate that his unpredictable behavior, such as ordering executions on a whim and changing his ministers with little explanation, was a sign of mental instability. Others argue that it was the result of a man who, faced with his mortality, sought control over every aspect of his life, no matter how destructive the methods. At the center of Henry's reign in these final years stood the wives who had either fallen victim to or were instrumental in the turbulence surrounding the king. His last two wives, Catherine Parr and Anne of Cleves, played significant roles in navigating the complicated political environment of his final days. Catherine, the widow of two men, was a sharp and capable woman. Her influence over Henry grew as she took on the role of caretaker, nursing the king through his illnesses. But her influence was not just maternal. She was a key player in the survival of the Tudor dynasty, helping to secure the throne for Henry's son Edward. Anne of Cleves, on the other hand, had been wed to Henry only briefly. Their marriage, though short-lived, was a curious chapter in the king's life. It is said that Henry was repulsed by Anne's appearance, though there is some debate among historians about whether this was an honest reaction or simply an excuse for a hasty annulment. Despite the failure of their marriage, Anne played a significant role in the king's later life, living in England as a friend and ally to the royal family. These two women, along with Henry's ministers, navigated the delicate balance of maintaining control over the kingdom in the midst of a dying king. But it wasn't just the immediate circle around Henry that was impacted by his final days. The entire nation held its breath, waiting to see who would emerge as the next ruler of England. Would it be his son, the young Edward? Or would the court descend into chaos as the power struggles of those around Henry intensified? As the courtiers and politicians scrambled for control in the final years of Henry VIII's life, the atmosphere in the royal court grew more intense with each passing day. The fear of what would come next, the power struggles, the uncertainty, and the looming question of who would succeed the ailing king gripped everyone who had any stake in the throne. But while the political machinations of the court were front and center, what was happening inside Henry's body was just as captivating. After all, it was his failing health that had set the stage for everything that followed. Henry's physical condition was worsening in ways that few could have predicted. His enormous weight caused constant pain and discomfort, exacerbating his already fragile state. His legs, which had once carried him across battlefields and into the hearts of his subjects, were now almost entirely useless, swollen with ulcers that made walking impossible. He spent much of his time lying in bed, only occasionally emerging for brief meetings or state matters, which were becoming more and more rare. The once energetic and commanding king, the man who had stood as a symbol of English strength, now looked frail and weak, as though the very power he had wielded so forcefully was slipping away with every labored breath. Historians still argue whether Henry's physical decline had any psychological effect on his judgment, or whether his ruling style had always been as erratic as it seemed in his final years. Some believe that his deteriorating health and inability to maintain his former vigor caused him to become paranoid and increasingly unstable, while others suggest that it was simply the last vestiges of his authoritarian rule at work, after all. Henry had always been quick to remove threats to his power. As the weeks passed, it became clear that Henry could not hold on much longer. The king, who had once been a titan in the European political landscape, was now seen by many as a man already half gone. However, the people of England had little time to reflect on their king's health. With the future of the kingdom hanging in the balance, all eyes turned to the next potential ruler. Enter Edward Henry's only male heir. Edward VI, born to Henry and his third wife, Jane. Seymour had been Henry's pride and joy, his legitimate son, the one who could carry on the Tudor legacy. But Edward was only a child, not even 10 years old at the time of Henry's death. The question of who would govern in his stead was now the most pressing issue in England. Would it be the Seymour family who had gained favour through their connection to Jane? Or would the likes of the powerful Duke of Norfolk or the ambitious Thomas Cranmer, the Archbishop of Canterbury, attempt to seize control? The court became a political battleground, with factions vying for influence over the young king. Henry, even in his final moments, did his best to secure Edward's future, but his dying wish was riddled with contradictions complicated by his distrust of many around him. The regency, who would take control until Edward came of age, was a matter of grave importance, for it meant deciding the fate of the entire nation. But all of this political maneuvering was a mere distraction compared to the slow, inevitable reality that Henry VIII's death was fast approaching. His condition continued to worsen, and as the days stretched into weeks, it became harder to ignore the grim reality that the end was near. It was on January 28, 1547, after weeks of declining health, that King Henry VIII passed away. His death marked the end of an era, a reign that had reshaped England forever. The man who had broken from the Catholic Church to create the Church of England, the man who had married 6 times in pursuit of a male heir, was now gone. His death signified the beginning of a new chapter in England's history, but one filled with uncertainty. Henry's passing left a divided kingdom in its wake. England was on the precipice of dramatic change, and the future of the Tudor dynasty would depend on how those who remained in the court could navigate the treacherous waters of succession. With Henry VIII's death, the English court was thrown into a frenzy. The final months of his life had been filled with growing uncertainty, and now that he was gone, the true nature of the struggle for power became painfully clear. The throne passed to young Edward VI, but at the age of 9, he was hardly fit to rule. Thus, the real power rested with the regents, a collection of ambitious men and women who had supported Henry in his final days, but who now saw the young king's minority as an opportunity to consolidate power. One of the first figures to take centre stage after Henry's death was the Duke of Somerset, Edward's uncle, and appointed protector of the realm. Somerset was seen by many as a strong and capable leader, but his rapid ascent to power was marred by the fierce opposition of those who felt he would be too dominant. The Duke of Norfolk, a senior member of the Tudor court, also sought control and was keen to ensure that his faction would not be overshadowed by Somerset's rise. Thus the stage was set for the dramatic struggles that would define Edward VI's reign. Historians still argue over whether Henry VIII's intentions for his son's reign were clear. Some believe that Henry had hoped for a strong regency under Somerset, someone who could protect the legacy of the Tudor dynasty. Others suggest that the old king had always intended for his son to take full control as soon as possible, and that the regency was meant only to guide him until he was of age. Whatever Henry's wishes may have been, they were ultimately shaped by the ambitions and loyalties of those around him, all of whom had their own vision for the future of England. As the regents worked to secure power, they also had to contend with the religious legacy Henry had left behind. The creation of the Church of England was a central part of Henry's reign, and his death did not bring an end to the religious tensions that had started to simmer under his rule. The Protestant Reformation, which had begun under Henry's watch, continued to shape English society during Edward VI's reign, and with Protestantism increasingly gaining favour at court, those who supported Catholicism became increasingly marginalised. This religious divide was particularly evident in the struggle between the likes of Somerset and Norfolk, both of whom had differing views on how best to navigate England's religious future. Somerset, along with his allies, leaned towards Protestant reform, while Norfolk and his supporters were sympathetic to the Catholic faith. This clash between reformers and traditionalists threatened to destabilize the regency and ultimately the court's ability to maintain control over the kingdom. But beyond the court intrigues and political infighting, the larger issue was how to govern a nation that had for much of Henry's reign been ruled with a firm and unyielding hand. The king's autocratic style of leadership had been one of the defining features of his reign. In the absence of such a strong figure, the regents struggled to maintain order and ensure that the country did not descend into chaos. Edward VI's reign was marked by short-term victories and long-term challenges. While he was crowned as a Protestant king, his reign was often unstable. His death in 1553 at just 15 years old led to further turmoil as his cousin Lady Jane Grey briefly ascended to the throne before being deposed in favor of Mary I, Henry VIII's eldest daughter. The Tudor dynasty was far from secure, and with each shift in power, England's future seemed more uncertain than ever. In a way, Henry's death marked the beginning of England's shift from the authority of a single commanding monarch to the turbulent faction-driven politics of the mid-Tudor period. His reign had left the country changed in fundamental ways, but the true legacy of his death would be felt in the power struggles and religious conflicts that followed. As we move away from the tumult of Henry VIII's court, let's shift focus for a moment. While Henry's life was filled with power plays and political maneuvering, his death set in motion another fascinating chapter of history, the mummification practices of ancient Egypt. You might think there's little connection between a 16th-century English king and the embalming of the dead. But the rituals and cultural importance of mummies in ancient Egypt offer an interesting contrast to the very real and political death that Henry experienced. While the Tudor court was consumed with the machinations of succession and power, the ancient Egyptians were focusing on something entirely different, the afterlife. Now that we've left behind the corridors of Henry VIII's court, let's journey to the scorching heat of the Nile, where an entirely different kind of legacy was being forged, one that still captivates the world today, the art of mummification in ancient Egypt. In fact, there's something eerily timeless about the process. While Henry's life was marked by ruthless ambition, the Egyptians were obsessed with ensuring that even in death a person's soul could live on forever. Imagine a time long before the conveniences of modern medicine, where the preservation of the body after death was not just an act of respect, but a means to secure eternal life. The ancient Egyptians believed that in order to survive in the afterlife, a body had to be perfectly preserved. And so they developed a process of mummification that would make even the most sophisticated modern embalming techniques seem like child's play. Of course, they didn't have fancy chemicals or formaldehyde at their disposal, but they had an incredible understanding of how to prevent decay using natural resources. It was nothing short of ingenious. The mummification process itself was both a scientific and spiritual endeavor. The first step in mummifying a body was to remove the internal organs, which were crucial to the preservation of the body. The heart, however, was usually left in place. Why, well, historians still argue over this. Some say it was because the heart was considered the seat of the soul, so to remove it would be to risk leaving the soul lost forever. Others argue that the Egyptians simply didn't have the means to properly preserve it, so they left it where it was. After the organs were removed, they were often placed in canopic jars, each jar representing one of the 4 sons of Horus, the Egyptian god who protected the body. The jars were intricately decorated, often with faces that represented the gods, and were placed near the mummified body to ensure that the soul would remain protected as it traveled to the afterlife. But the embalming didn't stop there. The body was then dried out using natron, a naturally occurring salt found along the banks of the Nile. This process could take weeks as the body was carefully preserved, dried and wrapped in layers of linen. Historians still argue whether the mummification process was as standardized as we think. Some believe it was an intricate art reserved for the elite, with only pharaohs and high priests receiving the most elaborate treatments. Others suggest that mummification was available to a wider range of society, though the quality and extent of the preservation depended on one's status. Whether you were a royal or a humble servant, the Egyptians believed that your journey to the afterlife was of the utmost importance, and mummification was the key to ensuring a safe passage. Once the body had been prepared, it was wrapped in linen bandages, and the final touches were applied. Amulets, jewelry, and even a mask were placed over the face to protect the deceased from evil spirits. The Egyptians believed that the spirit would need help recognizing its body in the afterlife, so these final details were essential. The wrapped body was then placed in a tomb, accompanied by treasures, food, and offerings, so the deceased could enjoy the afterlife just as they had enjoyed life. Sometimes entire burial chambers were filled with elaborate murals depicting scenes of daily life, giving the deceased a glimpse of the world they left behind. It's fascinating to think that, in their obsession with preserving the physical body, the Egyptians were also creating an elaborate ritual designed to ensure that their souls lived on forever. The careful attention to detail and the reverence they showed to their dead was something that transcended time. Today we still marvel at the mummies they left behind, some of which have survived for thousands of years, providing us with invaluable insights into their culture, their beliefs, and their way of life. Historians still argue over how the Egyptians managed to achieve such a high degree of preservation without the technology we have today. Some believe they had advanced knowledge of chemistry far beyond what we currently know, while others argue that they simply had an unparalleled understanding of the natural environment and the processes of decay. Regardless of how it was done, the fact remains that the Egyptians' efforts to preserve the body have captured the imagination of generations. As we take a moment to reflect on the wonders of ancient Egypt's mummification, it's hard not to think about how different their concerns were from those of Henry VIII. While Henry was desperately trying to maintain control over his kingdom, the Egyptians were concerned with something entirely different, ensuring that their souls could transcend time and space, surviving the journey to the afterlife. It's an intriguing contrast, one king preoccupied with his physical legacy, the other with his spiritual one. The deeper we dive into the world of ancient Egypt, the more we realize just how integral mummification was to their view of the afterlife. It wasn't simply a means to preserve the body, it was a doorway. To the Egyptians, death wasn't an end, but a transition, and mummification ensured that the deceased would make it safely to that next world. This belief in the afterlife was so deeply embedded in their culture that it affected every aspect of their lives, from the construction of their tombs to the way they planned for death, even their art and daily rituals. As we think about the great tombs of the pharaohs, such as the pyramids of Giza, it's easy to see how deeply intertwined mummification was with the Egyptian idea of immortality. These massive stone structures were more than just impressive monuments. They were celestial vessels designed to carry the pharaoh's soul safely to the heavens. Inside, the tombs were filled with treasures, food, and offerings to provide for the king in the afterlife. It's almost as if these tombs were not only meant to house the physical remains of the king, but to act as a time capsule, preserving not just the body, but the very essence of the man and his reign. The most famous of these tombs, of course, is that of King Tutankhamun, the young pharaoh whose tomb was discovered in 1922 by archaeologist Howard Carter. Tut's tomb is a shining example of how mummification was tied to power and belief. When Carter first opened the tomb, he found it filled with exquisite treasures, from golden jewelry to intricately carved statues, all placed there to ensure Tut's successful journey to the afterlife. His body still wrapped in layers of linen and placed in an elaborately decorated sarcophagus was the centerpiece of the tomb. For centuries, Tut's tomb had been sealed, untouched, a silent witness to both the opulence of the ancient world and the sacred rites surrounding death and mummification. But there's another layer to the story of mummification, the belief in the power of the body itself. To the ancient Egyptians, preserving the body wasn't simply a matter of physical decay, it was a spiritual endeavor. They believed that the soul, or ka, needed a home, and if the body was destroyed, the soul would have no place to reside. This belief is why the Egyptians placed so much emphasis on keeping the body intact and surrounded by everything it might need in the afterlife. The body wasn't just a vessel, it was a crucial part of the soul's continued existence. This made mummification not just an art, it was a deeply spiritual practice, a fundamental part of Egyptian identity. Historians still argue over the specifics of the afterlife beliefs in ancient Egypt. Some scholars suggest that early Egyptians believed in a somewhat simplistic idea of the afterlife, where the soul would journey through various challenges and tests before being judged. Others believe that by the time of the New Kingdom, these beliefs had evolved into a more complex system where the deceased could attain eternal life in a paradise-like field of reeds. Whatever the case, it's clear that mummification was never just about the body, it was about the soul's journey through death and into eternity. The act of mummification was reserved for the elite, but it wasn't just about the royals or the powerful. As Egypt's society became more advanced, even common people began to seek out mummification as a way to ensure that their souls would reach the afterlife. Of course, the process for the wealthy was far more elaborate, with more attention to detail, greater use of precious materials and tombs that rivaled those of the pharaohs. But for the majority, the act of mummification was still seen as a vital step in securing eternal life. The dead were treated with respect, and their journey to the afterlife was taken just as seriously as the life they had led. In fact, many of the mummies discovered by archaeologists were of people who had been high-ranking priests or wealthy citizens. Some were military leaders, others were craftsmen or merchants. What they all had in common was that they were granted a process of mummification which marked their transition from life to death as a moment of dignity and sacredness. Though they weren't pharaohs, they were still regarded as important enough to be preserved for eternity, a testament to the deeply ingrained cultural belief that every individual, no matter their status, had a soul worthy of protection. But not all mummies were created equal. Over the centuries, archaeologists have uncovered different types of mummification techniques, depending on the period and the region. From the simple natural mummies created by desert conditions to the highly elaborate process involving intricate embalming and wrapping mummification evolved alongside Egyptian society. And just as we saw with the royal tombs, the art of mummification became increasingly sophisticated, with mummies being prepared not just to preserve the body, but to reflect the importance of the individual's life and legacy. As we consider the mummification of individuals throughout Egypt's history, it becomes clear that the practice was not just about ensuring that the dead could live on in the afterlife. It was about creating a legacy, a way of immortalizing the deceased even as the world around them changed. Much like the legacy left by Henry VIII in England, the mummies of Egypt are now part of a narrative that transcends time. Though centuries separate these two kings, they both sought to preserve their legacy long after their deaths. One through political power, the other through spiritual preservation. And in both cases, history has ensured that their stories live on. While the mummification process in ancient Egypt may have been one of the most fascinating rituals of the ancient world, it's also one of the most misunderstood. From the moment we first encounter Egyptian mummies, there's an inherent sense of mystique that surrounds them, as though they hold the keys to untold secrets. But what if I told you that in a way the discovery of mummies and their tombs has led to more questions than answers? The mummies themselves provide incredible insight into the Egyptian way of life, but many mysteries remain unsolved. Take, for instance, the tomb of King Tutankhamun. In 1922, when the famous British archaeologist Howard Carter unearthed the tomb. It became an instant global sensation. Inside, he found not only an incredibly well-preserved mummy, but also a treasure trove of artifacts that had been placed there to accompany Tut into the afterlife. But while the treasures were awe-inspiring, it was the mummy itself that became the focal point of widespread fascination. For years, people speculated about the curse associated with Tut's tomb. Rumors of untimely deaths surrounding the people who had entered the tomb seemed to fuel the mystery. Historians still argue about the so-called curse of the pharaohs. Was it a coincidence that several members of the excavation team died under mysterious or unfortunate circumstances shortly after entering Tut's tomb? Or was it just the result of the unrelenting stresses of early 20th century archaeological expeditions? Some suggest that the curse was a product of the media's desire to sensationalize the find. After all, it's hard to resist a good story when it involves ancient curses, hidden treasures, and the possibility of ancient Egyptian wrath. But others believe that the curse could be linked to the tomb's security. Perhaps the curse was a reflection of the protections placed around the king's resting place by the priests who sought to preserve the sanctity of the afterlife. Whatever the truth behind the curse, the fascination with Tutankhamun and his mummified remains has led to countless debates about the significance of the afterlife in Egyptian society. What did it truly mean to be preserved for eternity? Was it simply about spiritual preservation, or was it a manifestation of Egypt's desire to establish a lasting legacy? Unlike Henry VIII, who was obsessed with securing a direct heir to continue his legacy, the Egyptians took a broader view. Their legacy was tied not only to their descendants, but to their eternal souls, whose journey would last far beyond the constraints of time. The debate over Tut's curse is just one example of the many questions that remain unanswered regarding Egyptian mummification. For instance, historians have long been puzzled by the fact that many royal mummies, including that of Tutankhamun, show signs of physical ailments or abnormalities. Tut, for example, suffered from a cleft palate clubfoot, and possibly even malaria, yet he was still embalmed with the same reverence afforded to the most powerful of Egyptian pharaohs. Some scholars argue that the presence of these afflictions reflects the reality of Egyptian royalty at the time, that even those who were seen as divine figures were subject to human frailties and imperfections. Historians still argue whether the mummification process was originally reserved only for the nobility, or whether over time it became more widely accessible to the general population. Archaeological discoveries have revealed mummified bodies of priests, soldiers, and even commoners, suggesting that the process may have been democratized as the years went on. The more recent discoveries of animal mummies also add to this mystery. Sacred animals like cats and crocodiles were mummified in vast numbers, leading some historians to speculate on the religious significance of animals in Egyptian society. Were they treated as equals in death, or were they seen as intermediaries between the gods and the human world? Another puzzle lies in the technology used by the Egyptians to embalm and preserve their dead. The precise methods they used to remove organs and preserve bodies still baffle modern scientists. While we've gained an understanding of the general principles of mummification, there are still aspects of the process that remain elusive. For example, the use of natron, a naturally occurring salt from the Nile River, is essential in the mummification process. Yet the ancient Egyptians' knowledge of its chemical properties is still a subject of speculation. How did they understand the science of preservation in such an advanced way without the help of modern chemistry? Was it purely through trial and error, or did they possess knowledge that we have long since lost? As we take a step back and look at the broader picture, we see a culture that was remarkably advanced in its understanding of the human body disease and the process of death. But more than that, the Egyptians had an incredible understanding of the connection between life and death. Unlike Henry VIII's obsession with legacy through power and influence, the Egyptians believed in leaving behind a spiritual legacy, a legacy that transcended death and entered the realm of eternity. The idea of immortality was not limited to the physical body, but extended to the very essence of a person's soul. The fascination with mummification continues today, with scientists and archaeologists constantly discovering new mummies, new tombs, and new insights into this ancient art. Whether it's the mummies of royal Egyptians or the lesser-known individuals who were preserved for their journey to the afterlife, each discovery deepens our understanding of a culture that believed so fervently in the continuation of the soul. Their techniques may have been born thousands of years ago, but their effects ripple through time, captivating us even today. As we continue to explore the world of Egyptian mummification, let's consider the symbolic and religious importance that the mummified body held. While Henry VIII's reign was often concerned with the tangible political power, marriage succession, the Egyptians were fixated on something far more ethereal. For them, mummification was not just about preserving the physical body. It was about ensuring that the soul, or Ka, would have a permanent home for eternity. Their belief in an afterlife was so profound that every step of the mummification process was steeped in religious significance. The ancient Egyptians believed that death was merely a transition to another world, a journey that could be as meaningful as the life that preceded it. One of the key concepts in Egyptian religion was the idea of Ma'at, the divine order of the universe. The Egyptians believed that maintaining Ma'at was essential for cosmic harmony, and a person's death and subsequent preservation through mummification were seen as integral to upholding this cosmic balance. The body therefore needed to be preserved perfectly to ensure that the soul could continue its journey into the afterlife and be judged by Osiris, the god of the dead. This judgment would determine whether the deceased could enter the paradise of the afterlife or whether they would be cast into the void. For many Egyptians, the idea of Ma'at was closely tied to their notions of social order and justice. The rich and powerful may have had access to more elaborate mummification processes, but they were not exempt from the judgment of Osiris. The dead were not judged by their status in life. They were judged by the purity of their soul, measured against the scales of justice. But for the everyday person, having their body properly preserved and placed in a tomb was still an essential part of their spiritual journey. Even the humblest members of Egyptian society would seek to secure a peaceful afterlife through mummification. Historians still argue about the extent to which Egyptian mummification was influenced by religious beliefs versus social and cultural practices. Was mummification primarily about ensuring a safe passage to the afterlife, or was it an expression of the profound reverence the Egyptians had for the human body? Some scholars suggest that mummification was a direct reflection of the Egyptian belief in resurrection and eternal life. Others believe that it was also a reflection of the societal need to establish a connection between the living and the dead, particularly in a world where ancestral worship played a significant role in daily life. One of the most fascinating aspects of Egyptian mummification is how it connected the physical body with the divine. The embalming process wasn't just about preserving the flesh, it was also about imbuing the body with spiritual significance. Many tombs were adorned with paintings, carvings, and texts that depicted the deceased's journey to the afterlife, a process meant to remind the soul of its divine purpose. These tombs were not just places for the body to rest, they were sanctuaries where the living and the dead could communicate, where offerings of food, drink, and incense could be made in an effort to sustain the deceased in the afterlife. The more elaborate tombs, especially those of pharaohs, were designed as small replicas of the living world. They were equipped with everything the deceased might need for eternity: food, furniture, tools, and even slaves in earlier times. In fact, these tombs were so complex and well-stocked that many Egyptians believed they would live on just as they had when they were alive. They were not merely lying in state. They were embarking on a journey to a world just beyond the physical realm where they would be able to enjoy the same comforts and pleasures as in life, but without the restrictions of the mortal world. When we look at the tombs and the mummies that have been uncovered, we begin to understand just how much the Egyptians valued continuity, both in life and in death. Their society was built around the idea that life didn't end with death. Rather, it was simply a transition. For Henry VIII, his legacy was wrapped in political victories and the bloodlines of his heirs, but for the ancient Egyptians, the continuity of the soul preserved in the mummified body was far more significant. Historians still argue whether the elaborate practices surrounding Egyptian tombs and mummification reflect a deeply spiritual connection to the afterlife, or whether they were symbolic of the complex social hierarchies of Egyptian society. Did the process of mummification and the rich material culture of tombs represent a society focused on spiritual development, or was it an assertion of the power and wealth of the elite? In either case, it's clear that mummification was much more than just a death ritual. It was a cultural statement about life legacy and the divine order. Interestingly, the spiritual beliefs surrounding death and mummification were not limited to Egypt. In other parts of the ancient world, different cultures practiced their own forms of body preservation, each with their unique religious or philosophical perspectives. But none were as meticulous or as deeply entwined with their belief in the afterlife as the Egyptians. Even today, thousands of years later, the Egyptian fascination with death and mummification continues to capture the imaginations of people across the globe. As we reflect on the differences between Henry VIII's pursuit of legacy through power and the Egyptians' pursuit of immortality through the preservation of the soul, we can't help but marvel at how both cultures were, in their own ways, striving for the same thing: continuity. Henry's legacy might have been defined by the children he left behind and the institutions he built. But the Egyptians, through their incredible mummification techniques, created a legacy that transcended time itself, one that still speaks to us in the present day. As we continue to explore the legacy of mummification in ancient Egypt, it's important to consider the fascinating role of the gods in this sacred practice. Unlike Henry VIII, whose reign was dictated by personal ambition and a desperate desire for control, the Egyptians saw death and mummification through the lens of divine intervention. To them, the gods were not only instrumental in life, but also in death. The most crucial of these gods was Osiris, the god of the afterlife, resurrection, and regeneration. In Egyptian mythology, Osiris was the ruler of the underworld and the judge of the dead. His judgment was what ultimately determined whether the soul of the deceased would continue its journey into the afterlife or be cast into oblivion. This divine connection between death and the gods wasn't just metaphorical, it was deeply practical. Every step of the mummification process, from the removal of the organs to the wrapping of the body in linen, was performed with the blessing and protection of specific deities. The embalming process was seen as a ritual purification, ensuring that the soul would not only survive death, but also be able to reach the divine realm of Osiris, where it would find eternal peace and life. In many ways, the Egyptians treated mummification as a partnership between the living and the divine, ensuring that both the body and soul would be protected through the power of the gods. Historians still debate the significance of Osiris in mummification. Was he the sole divine figure associated with death, or did the Egyptians view death as a more complex spiritual experience involving multiple gods? While Osiris played the central role in ensuring a successful afterlife, other deities like Anubis, the god of embalming, were also intimately connected to the preservation process. Anubis, often depicted as a jackal-headed figure, was responsible for overseeing the mummification of the body and the protection of the soul. His role was so crucial that some mummies were even placed with small figurines of Anubis to aid them on their journey to the afterlife. The involvement of these gods in the process of death and mummification demonstrates the deeply religious nature of Egyptian culture. For the Egyptians, death was not an event to be feared, but a sacred passage that required the favor and intervention of the gods. They viewed their relationship with the divine as essential for a smooth transition to the afterlife. It was through this connection that the Egyptians sought to secure immortality, not just in the form of mummification, but in the form of divine protection. In comparison, Henry VIII's obsession with legacy was driven by his desire to control the future of his kingdom. For him, a secure dynasty through his children and heirs was paramount. His death and the passing of power to his son Edward VI were seen as a continuation of his earthly legacy. But whereas Henry's approach to legacy was rooted in his earthly power and influence, the Egyptians sought something more profound: eternal life in the afterlife. Their mummification practices were a direct reflection of this belief. While Henry's legacy was defined by the political structures he put in place and the bloodline he created, the Egyptians were focused on securing a connection with the divine and preserving the soul for eternity. This divine connection is perhaps best seen in the tombs that the Egyptians built for their pharaohs. These tombs were not merely burial places. They were temples of the gods designed to ensure that the deceased would be able to navigate the afterlife and be judged favorably by Osiris. The grandeur of the tombs, the meticulous care given to the mummification process, and the vast amount of treasures placed inside were all intended to show reverence for the gods and to help the deceased achieve a peaceful afterlife. Take, for instance, the tomb of the great pharaoh Ramses II, whose burial chamber was not only filled with treasures, but was also adorned with inscriptions of prayers and texts meant to guide him in the afterlife. His tomb, located in the Valley of the Kings, is a testament to the Egyptians' belief in the importance of divine assistance in death. These tombs were designed not only as physical resting places, but as gateways to the divine. They were equipped with everything the pharaoh needed to sustain his soul for eternity, ensuring that the passage from life to death was as smooth and seamless as possible. Historians still argue whether the grandeur of royal tombs, like those of Ramses II or Tutankhamun, was more about securing the pharaoh's place in the afterlife, or about displaying the wealth and power of the ruling class. Were these tombs purely religious symbols, or were they also political tools used to reinforce the king's divine status and authority? Some scholars believe the elaborate burial practices were an expression of Egypt's political hierarchy, reinforcing the king's divine rule. Others argue that the focus on the afterlife was a deeply personal matter for the pharaoh, who saw their tomb not as a monument for the living, but as a means of securing eternal life. As we reflect on the role of the gods in the mummification process, it's clear that the Egyptians viewed death as a sacred event, a transition not into nothingness but into another realm of existence. Their meticulous care in preparing the body and their belief in divine intervention reflect a profound respect for both the physical body and the soul. Unlike Henry VIII, who sought to extend his earthly legacy through his bloodline, the Egyptians saw death as a step toward an even greater legacy: eternal life. The divine aspect of Egyptian mummification also raises questions about how different cultures have viewed death and immortality. While Henry's death led to the passing of his temporal power and the fragility of his kingdom, the Egyptians sought to transcend the confines of time, believing their spiritual legacy would live on forever. In the end, both Henry and the Egyptians were concerned with leaving a lasting mark on the world, but the ways in which they pursued this immortality reveal just how differently two powerful civilizations can approach the idea of legacy and eternity. The fascinating legacy of mummification is not confined to Egypt alone. In fact, the practice of preserving the dead can be found in many cultures around the world, each with their own unique beliefs about death, the afterlife, and what it means to leave a legacy. But few practices are as iconic or as elaborate as the mummification of the ancient Egyptians. While Henry VIII's obsession with legacy was rooted in earthly power, his political maneuverings, marriages, and decisions to break from the Catholic Church, the Egyptians were focused on something that transcended the physical world: immortality through divine preservation. Take, for example, the ancient Chinese, whose tombs are filled with rich artifacts, protective figurines, and intricate burial rituals. Though not technically mummification, the preservation of the body in ancient China was similarly connected to the belief in a spiritual afterlife. The famous terracotta army discovered in the tomb of Emperor Qin Shi Huang is a striking example of how the Chinese viewed death and the afterlife. The emperor, seeking eternal life, surrounded his tomb with thousands of life-sized clay soldiers, horses and chariots, all designed to serve him in the afterlife. Much like the Egyptian tombs, these burial practices were intended to ensure that the soul of the emperor could travel safely into the next world. Similarly, in the Andean regions of South America, cultures such as the Incas practiced their own form of body preservation. While mummification was common, it wasn't always as elaborate as the Egyptian process. Some Andean cultures preserved the bodies of their elite by drying them out and wrapping them in textiles, creating mummies that were often placed in high-altitude tombs where the cold preserved their remains. These tombs were often located in inaccessible areas, making it clear that these mummies were not just dead, but revered as powerful figures who were meant to maintain their influence in the afterlife. The Inca belief in Inti, the sun god, and the cycle of death and rebirth mirrored Egypt's reverence for the gods of the afterlife. While these other cultures had their own distinct approaches to preserving the body, what all of these practices share is the belief in immortality, whether through the soul's journey to the afterlife or through a body that would remain intact forever, ensuring that the individual could continue to live on in some form. And while Henry VIII's death may have marked the end of his reign, the Egyptians and many others believed that death wasn't the end, but rather a transition. The notion of eternal life through the body, whether in the form of mummification or other preservation methods, stands in stark contrast to the finality of death that Henry VIII experienced. But even more interesting than the physical process of mummification is the idea of legacy itself. The different ways that these ancient cultures tried to secure their place in history. Henry VIII's legacy was complicated by his relationships with his wives, his break from the church, and his establishment of the Church of England. For him, securing his legacy was about preserving the power and influence of his family and bloodline, ensuring that his children would inherit his kingdom and continue his work. The Egyptians, on the other hand, were less concerned with the legacy of their rulers in the traditional sense. They sought immortality through their connection to the divine. Their legacy was not rooted in earthly power, but in their spiritual journey, ensuring that their souls would remain part of the cosmic order forever. It's fascinating to consider how both cultures, one driven by personal power and the other by divine preservation, approached death and legacy. The Egyptians, through their elaborate mummification process, were focused on the eternal. They believed that by preserving the body and offering prayers, food, and treasures to the deceased, they could ensure that the soul would continue to live forever in harmony with the gods. On the other hand, Henry VIII's legacy, although not tied to religious beliefs of immortality, is still with us today, albeit through the living generations of his family and the historical impact of his reign. His efforts to secure a lasting dynasty are present in the ongoing history of the British monarchy. Historians still argue whether the Egyptian emphasis on death and the afterlife was a reflection of a culture deeply concerned with the idea of power and control, or whether it was purely spiritual in nature. Did mummification and the grandeur of royal tombs serve to reinforce the divine right of kings, or were they simply an expression of the Egyptian reverence for the gods and the cosmic order? While there are no definitive answers, the debate itself points to one undeniable truth. The ancient Egyptians believed that life and death were intimately connected with their gods. The pharaohs as gods on earth were seen as the intermediaries between the divine and the human, and their afterlife was just as important as their earthly reign. Much like Henry VIII's obsession with securing a dynasty, the Egyptians were obsessed with ensuring their rulers were immortalized not just in the memories of their people, but in the realm of the gods. The fact that we can still learn from their mummies thousands of years later is a testament to the incredible foresight they had in ensuring their legacy lived on. The mummies of Egypt may be preserved in a way that transcends physical death, but in the end, their legacy lives on because of the stories we continue to tell about them, just as Henry VIII's reign continues to be a source of fascination and historical discussion. As we move further into the story of mummification, it's worth considering not just the religious and cultural implications, but the technological ingenuity that went into preserving the dead. The Egyptians, despite living thousands of years ago, displayed a level of sophistication in their embalming practices that modern science still marvels at. Imagine for a moment that you're standing beside an ancient Egyptian embalmer, watching him carefully remove the internal organs from the body using tools that seem surprisingly advanced for their time. These early embalmers had a deep understanding of anatomy, despite not having access to modern medical knowledge. One of the most striking aspects of mummification is the way the Egyptians understood the necessity of drying out the body. The key to preserving the body and preventing decay was to remove all moisture, which is why the embalming process involved the use of natron, a naturally occurring salt from the Nile. The embalmer would pack the body with this salt both inside and out, leaving it to dry out for several weeks. This dehydration process was essential to ensure that the body would be preserved for eternity. Even though they didn't have modern chemistry, the Egyptians had figured out one of the fundamental principles of preservation. Historians still argue about the extent of knowledge the Egyptians had in their understanding of chemistry. Some believe that they had an innate understanding of chemical properties, while others suggest that their techniques were based more on trial and error passed down through generations. What we do know is that the level of preservation achieved by the Egyptians was nothing short of remarkable. The fact that mummies from thousands of years ago can still be studied today is a testament to their skill. In contrast, Henry VIII's era, though centuries later, lacked such sophisticated methods of preserving the body. When Henry VIII died, the process of embalming was not nearly as advanced. His body was prepared quickly, as was customary for the ruling class, but the methods used were more rudimentary compared to those of the ancient Egyptians. In fact, some scholars believe that Henry's body was hastily embalmed in the midst of political and religious turmoil. Unlike the Egyptians, who saw the preservation of the body as a divine and spiritual necessity, the English focused more on quick and practical preparations for burial. This difference in approach reflects the contrast between Henry's desire for a legacy rooted in earthly matters, politics, succession, and power, and the Egyptian belief in a spiritual continuity that transcended the physical world. As we think about the embalming process in Egypt, it's also fascinating to consider how the techniques were developed and passed down through generations. The embalmers who worked in the royal tombs were highly trained and skilled, often starting their apprenticeships at a young age. Their knowledge was kept secret and was considered one of the most sacred professions in Egypt. In many ways, the embalmers were viewed as intermediaries between the living and the dead, entrusted with a task that was considered both a scientific and a spiritual duty. This reverence for the embalming profession highlights the Egyptians' belief that death wasn't just an end, it was an important ritual, one that required the utmost care and respect. Historians still debate the exact origins of Egyptian mummification. Was it something that developed over time as Egyptians became more concerned with the afterlife? Or was it a practice borrowed from other ancient cultures? Some scholars point to evidence of early forms of mummification in other parts of the world, such as the Chinchorro mummies of South America, which predate Egyptian mummification. However, the Egyptians were the ones who perfected the art, and their practices would go on to influence cultures around the world. The technique of mummification was so important to Egyptian society that it was not just reserved for pharaohs. While the most elaborate embalming methods were reserved for royalty and the elite, the process was also available to common people, albeit in a simpler form. Even though the preservation techniques for the commoners were less intricate, the concept remained the same: to preserve the body for the soul's journey into the afterlife. This was a society where even the poorest hoped to attain immortality, and the fact that the process of mummification was so widespread reflects the deeply spiritual nature of Egyptian culture. In the context of Henry VIII's reign, it's difficult not to draw comparisons between the ways in which different cultures approach death. Henry's concern with his own legacy was driven by a desire for earthly power and influence. He wanted to ensure that his bloodline continued and that his kingdom remained intact. But the Egyptians, in their mummification practices, were focused on ensuring that their souls remained connected to the divine and that their influence would extend beyond death into eternity. The contrast between Henry's approach to death and the Egyptians reflects broader differences in worldview. While Henry was concerned with what he could control in the physical world, the Egyptians placed their trust in the gods to secure a place for them in the afterlife, a place of eternal peace and prosperity. Historians still argue whether Henry's fear of death and his obsession with securing his legacy stemmed from a sense of divine right or from a more earthly desire to maintain control over his kingdom. But what's clear is that his view of legacy was fundamentally different from the Egyptians' focus on immortality. Where Henry VIII sought to control his kingdom, the Egyptians sought to transcend the earthly realm altogether, ensuring that their souls would live on forever. This duality of legacy, one focused on the physical world, the other on the spiritual, reflects the complexity of human nature and our universal desire to leave a lasting mark on history. As we move deeper into the realm of mummification and legacy, one of the most intriguing aspects of Egyptian burial practices is how the society viewed the concept of continuity. The idea that death was not the end, but a continuation of life in another form, permeated every aspect of Egyptian culture. While Henry VIII's obsession with legacy revolved around political power, dynastic continuity, and the preservation of his earthly rule, the Egyptians were more focused on a continuity that transcended the physical world, a continuation of the soul through the eternal realm of the gods. The Egyptians saw death as a necessary and transformative step, not an ending. In their minds, death was merely a bridge to the afterlife, where the soul would live on forever in an idealized version of life. The careful preservation of the body was critical to this process because it provided the soul with a home to return to when it was needed. This belief led to the intricate mummification process, where embalming wasn't just about preventing decay, it was about providing the soul with a proper vehicle for its journey into eternity. But mummification, with all its elaborate rituals, wasn't the only way the Egyptians sought immortality. Their understanding of legacy was deeply connected to their belief in the gods, particularly Osiris, the god of the afterlife and rebirth. Osiris was a symbol of resurrection, and his role in the mummification process was central. It wasn't just the preservation of the body that mattered, it was the spiritual rejuvenation of the soul which the mummification process enabled. This connection between life, death, and rebirth was seen as part of a larger cosmic order, one that was vital to the well-being of both the individual and the society as a whole. Unlike Henry VIII, who maintained power through his control of England and his continuous efforts to secure his heirs, the Egyptians' concept of immortality was not confined to physical lineage. Instead, their immortality was rooted in their relationship with the divine. The body preserved through mummification acted as a conduit to the divine realm, and it was through this connection that they believed they would secure a lasting legacy. The Egyptians saw the gods as protectors of the dead, guiding the soul through the trials of the afterlife, and ensuring that it was granted eternal life. This belief in divine protection and continuity stands in stark contrast to Henry VIII's view of legacy. Henry's obsession with ensuring the survival of his bloodline, though rooted in the desire to maintain power, was also a reflection of his belief in the importance of earthly dynastic continuity. He didn't just want his name to live on through monuments or historical accounts, he wanted it to live on through the very people who would inherit his power. While the Egyptians were focused on the soul's journey, Henry's vision of legacy was grounded in the flesh and blood of his descendants. Historians still argue whether Henry's preoccupation with his heirs was an expression of his own insecurities or a practical political maneuver. Was his obsession with securing a male heir, despite all the turmoil caused by his marriages, a reflection of his deep fear of mortality? Or was it a calculated attempt to secure the stability of his kingdom? Regardless, Henry's legacy is inextricably tied to his descendants. The political machinations, the break from Rome, and his tumultuous relationships all played a part in ensuring that his bloodline would continue. The Egyptians, on the other hand, were more focused on the continuity of the soul. Their legacy was not defined by the actions of their descendants, but by the preservation of the individual's spirit. The elaborate burial practices, the meticulous mummification, and the sacred rituals were all about ensuring that the individual could continue to exist in the afterlife, free from the limitations of the mortal world. Their legacy was not just about what they left behind, but about the eternal journey that awaited them after death. Despite the differences in approach, both cultures were deeply concerned with the idea of immortality and the preservation of legacy. Henry VIII, with his obsession for dynastic control, wanted to leave behind a kingdom ruled by his heirs. The Egyptians, however, sought a deeper form of immortality, one that was tied not to earthly power, but to the soul's journey into eternity. Their focus on the afterlife reflects their understanding of death as part of a larger cosmic cycle, where life and death were interconnected, and where the soul would continue to live on eternally reborn. As we look at the vast differences between these two approaches to legacy, it becomes clear that what we seek to preserve in life says a lot about how we view death. For Henry VIII, the desire for a tangible legacy through his family, his kingdom, and his political achievements was essential. But for the Egyptians, the preservation of the soul was the ultimate goal, and the mummification process was a way of ensuring that their legacy would endure for eternity, unbroken by time. Historians still argue whether Henry's obsession with legacy was driven by a desire for control or by a fear of being forgotten. Did he want to be remembered as a ruler who shaped England's destiny, or was he simply trying to stave off the inevitable? Similarly, the Egyptians' view of legacy was not just about preserving the physical body, it was about ensuring that the soul would continue to thrive, guided by the gods long after the body had decayed. This profound focus on spiritual continuity, grounded in divine protection and resurrection, offers a sharp contrast to the earthly concerns of Henry VIII. As we delve even further into the mysteries of mummification and legacy, one crucial aspect we haven't yet explored in detail is the role of tombs in Egyptian culture. Unlike the relatively simple and somewhat hurried burials seen in Henry VIII's England, Egyptian tombs were not just final resting places for the dead. They were meticulously designed sacred spaces meant to ensure the continuation of life after death. These tombs were often as elaborate as the palaces the pharaohs had lived in during their reigns, filled with treasures, food, statues, and offerings to accompany the soul on its journey to the afterlife. One of the most famous tombs, of course, is that of Tutankhamun. Discovered in 1922 by archaeologist Howard Carter, Tut's tomb was found largely intact, with many of its treasures still in place. Unlike most royal tombs which had been looted long before their discovery, Tutankhamun's tomb provided an incredible glimpse into the grandeur of Egyptian burial practices. The artifacts inside his tomb were meant to serve the young king in the afterlife, from golden chariots to intricately crafted jewelry. Everything was included to ensure that Tut would be comfortable and well-equipped for his journey to the next world. What's even more remarkable about Tut's tomb is the wealth of information it has provided about Egyptian life, far more than any other royal tomb, allowing historians to better understand the practices of embalming, burial, and the spiritual beliefs surrounding death. Historians still argue over the exact purpose of these treasures. Were they meant to serve as representations of what the deceased would need in the afterlife? Or were they symbolic of the power and wealth that the pharaoh had amassed during their reign? Some scholars suggest that the treasures were designed not only to help the soul of the deceased survive the journey, but also to display the ruler's earthly legacy and wealth, ensuring that their name and their kingdom would live on. However, the overwhelming focus on preserving the soul in Egyptian culture indicates that these offerings were primarily intended for spiritual purposes, ensuring that the soul would have everything it needed to navigate the afterlife and achieve immortality. In contrast, Henry VIII's burial was far less elaborate. Upon his death, his body was quickly embalmed, placed in a coffin, and interred in St. George's Chapel at Windsor Castle, beside his third wife, Jane Seymour. His tomb, while grand, was not nearly as elaborate as the tombs of Egyptian pharaohs. The king's funeral arrangements, though formal, were marked by the political turmoil of the time. There was no treasure to accompany his body, no vast array of offerings for his soul. Instead, his tomb was more of a testament to the monarchy's continuity, an assurance that his place in history would be remembered not by the objects placed in his tomb, but by the legacy he left behind through his heirs and the nation he had shaped. While Henry VIII's tomb may have been a symbol of his reign, it lacked the elaborate symbolism and reverence seen in Egyptian tombs. The focus in England was not on ensuring the king's soul had a smooth journey to the afterlife, but rather on marking his death as a political event. It was a reminder of his power during his lifetime, but lacked the spiritual depth seen in Egypt. This marks a stark contrast between Henry's approach to legacy and that of the Egyptians, whose tombs and mummification practices were deeply rooted in their understanding of death and the afterlife. One of the more fascinating aspects of Egyptian burial practices was the use of funerary texts. These texts, often inscribed on the walls of tombs, were designed to guide the soul through the afterlife. The most famous of these texts is the Egyptian Book of the Dead, a collection of spells and incantations that were meant to protect the soul from the dangers of the afterlife and ensure it could pass through the various trials it would face on its journey. These texts were often placed with the mummified body, ensuring that the deceased would have access to divine protection and knowledge during their spiritual journey. In Henry VIII's England, however, the afterlife was not something that could be navigated with spells and rituals in quite the same way. While England had its own set of religious practices heavily influenced by Christianity, there was no comparable set of texts to guide the soul. Instead, the focus was more on the individual's relationship with God and the certainty that upon death, one would be judged and either enter heaven or hell. Henry VIII's religious reforms, particularly, his break from the Catholic Church, made the question of the afterlife even more complex. His creation of the Church of England altered the religious landscape, and the spiritual understanding of death became more fragmented as a result. In Egypt, there was a unified vision of the afterlife that transcended political or religious shifts, grounded in the belief in divine judgment and resurrection. Despite these differences in approach, the core concern in both cultures was similar: the desire for legacy and immortality. Henry VIII, like the Egyptian pharaohs, wanted his name to be remembered long after his death. For the Egyptians, that immortality was achieved through the soul's journey to the afterlife, while Henry's legacy was to be carried on through his bloodline and the political structures he put in place. While Henry may not have had the same spiritual concerns as the Egyptians, his need for his legacy to survive death was no less intense. Both were deeply concerned with how history would remember them, but where the Egyptians sought to transcend death through divine power, Henry sought to ensure that his earthly power would continue even beyond the grave. Historians still argue about the significance of tombs in the broader context of legacy. Were the elaborate tombs of Egyptian pharaohs purely symbolic of their divine status? Or were they a more complex way of ensuring that the deceased would be immortalized for eternity? Similarly, Henry VIII's tomb, while far simpler, reminds us of how different cultures viewed the act of death and the preservation of legacy. For the Egyptians, the tomb was a spiritual tool to ensure eternal life. For Henry, it was a symbol of his reign and his lasting influence on English history. As we approach the end of our journey through the world of mummification and legacy, it's important to recognize how the fascinating rituals and practices of ancient Egypt have influenced not only our understanding of the past, but our modern-day fascination with death and immortality. Mummies have captivated the imagination of people for centuries. From the discovery of King Tutankhamun's tomb to the modern-day fascination with Egyptian artifacts, the mummified remains of ancient Egyptians continue to be a window into a world long gone, yet still very much alive in our collective consciousness. The Egyptians, with their elaborate burial practices, didn't just prepare for their own death, they left behind a legacy that would transcend the centuries. The tombs, the mummies, and the burial goods they left behind weren't just about wealth or power, they were about eternity. By creating such intricate rituals for the dead, the Egyptians ensured that their culture would be remembered not just through the artifacts, but through their spiritual beliefs. Their practices surrounding mummification represented an enduring commitment to the belief that life could go on after death, provided the proper steps were taken. Today, when we look at the mummies of Egypt, we're not just looking at the past, we're looking at a vision of immortality that continues to captivate us. Historians still argue about how much of this belief in immortality was rooted in Egypt's religious practices versus its political needs. Some suggest that the tombs and mummies were more about reinforcing the power of the pharaohs, creating monuments to their divine status. Others argue that the mummification process was purely spiritual, an attempt to guarantee that the soul would survive for eternity. In either case, what's clear is that the Egyptians had a complex and deeply ingrained understanding of death, and they made every effort to ensure that their legacy would live on. While Henry VIII might not have had the same deep spiritual understanding of death as the Egyptians, his desire for legacy mirrored theirs in some respects. Like the pharaohs, Henry sought to establish a lasting dynasty, but his legacy was more focused on the material world, his bloodline, his kingdom, and his influence over the course of history. The religious turbulence he created through his break with the Catholic Church and his establishment of the Church of England left a profound mark on English history, ensuring his place in the history books. However, Henry VIII's legacy is rooted in the power he wielded during his lifetime, not in spiritual beliefs or an eternal afterlife. In many ways, Henry's need to create a legacy through his descendants reflects a different approach to immortality compared to the Egyptians. For Henry, immortality meant his name living on through his heirs, his influence enduring in the political structures he created, and his kingdom surviving through the Tudor line. The Egyptians, on the other hand, saw immortality as something that extended beyond the human realm, existing in the hands of the gods and continuing into the afterlife. While Henry sought earthly immortality, the Egyptians believed in a form of immortality that was bound to the divine and to the eternal. Yet, despite their differences, both Henry VIII and the ancient Egyptians were obsessed with one thing: legacy. Whether it was the pharaohs wrapped in linen and embalmed with care, or Henry VIII, whose kingdom was to be carried on by his heirs, both sought to ensure that their influence would outlive their mortal selves. Henry's focus on bloodline and political continuity, and the Egyptians' focus on spiritual eternity, reflect the two sides of legacy. One rooted in power, the other in the divine. As we look back on both Henry's reign and the mummification practices of ancient Egypt, it's clear that both were driven by the same fundamental desire to be remembered. Henry VIII's tomb, though simpler, still stands as a testament to his life and his reign. Meanwhile, the tombs of the Egyptians, their mummies carefully preserved, speak to the eternal journey they believed was waiting for them in the afterlife. These tombs and the mummies within them are the ultimate symbols of legacy, offering insight into what these cultures valued and how they sought to secure their place in history. While Henry VIII's legacy has lived on through his political reforms and his descendants, the Egyptians have left a different kind of legacy. Their legacy is found not only in their monuments and tombs, but in the belief that life is eternal, that the soul is immortal, and that death is simply another step in an infinite journey. And though Henry VIII may have feared the finality of death, the Egyptians embraced it as part of the natural cycle of existence, an end that led to something far greater. Historians still argue about which form of legacy is more lasting. Is it the material political legacy of Henry VIII rooted in the real-world power of his monarchy and his bloodline? Or is it the spiritual, eternal legacy of the Egyptians, whose mummified remains still provide a direct link to the past and the divine? In the end, both leave behind a mark, one in the form of lasting political influence, and the other in the form of a belief in eternal life. Regardless of how they are remembered, both Henry VIII and the Egyptians have ensured their place in history, each leaving behind something that will continue to captivate future generations. As we close this journey through the tombs of Egypt and the legacy of Henry VIII, we are reminded that death is not just an end, it is a transition. It's a step into the unknown, but one that has been carefully navigated by cultures throughout history. Whether through mummification, royal tombs, or dynastic power, every culture has sought a way to ensure that their legacy lives on. And in the case of the Egyptians, their understanding of death and immortality still lives on today through their mummies, their tombs, and their profound belief in the eternal journey of the soul. As we conclude our exploration into the lasting legacy of mummification, both in ancient Egypt and the life of Henry VIII, it's remarkable how these two distinct paths to immortality converge and diverge across time. Henry's reign was defined by earthly politics, his desire for control over his kingdom, and a continuous aggressive push for power and succession. Meanwhile, the Egyptians' approach to immortality was shaped by a spiritual vision of life after death, where the soul would live on in harmony with the gods. The difference in their views on death, legacy, and the afterlife is a testament to the cultural contrasts that shaped these two civilizations. The Egyptians, with their meticulous mummification practices, believed in a cosmic order that stretched far beyond the physical realm. They saw mummification as a sacred duty, not just to preserve the body, but to facilitate the soul's passage to eternity. From the moment of death, the soul's journey was intricately intertwined with the gods. This journey was protected, guided, and celebrated with grand tombs, sacred rituals, and divine protection. Every step of the process was steeped in religious symbolism, from the embalming to the tomb itself, all with the purpose of ensuring that the deceased would live on in the afterlife. Their legacy was not just about material wealth or political power, but about an eternal divine continuation. On the other hand, Henry VIII, while undeniably a larger-than-life figure in English history, viewed death from a more temporal human perspective. His legacy was marked by political struggles, the formation of the Church of England, his tumultuous marriages, and his hopes for a male heir to ensure the continuation of the Tudor dynasty. Though his reign left indelible marks on English history, his death and the subsequent succession were more about securing control over the kingdom than any spiritual transcendence. His legacy lives on through the English monarchy and its enduring influence, but it's grounded in the material world, in the very real political decisions he made during his reign. As we contrast these two figures, Henry VIII, a man who died a monarch and sought immortality through his dynasty, and the Egyptians who achieved a form of immortality through spiritual rites, we see two vastly different ways of understanding legacy. For Henry, it was the earthly power and influence that mattered most. For the Egyptians, it was the soul's journey beyond death that truly defined legacy, making their practices not just about preservation, but about achieving eternal life. Interestingly, the study of mummification itself has served as a bridge between these two worlds. The discovery of Egyptian mummies thousands of years after their burial serves as a form of time travel, offering us glimpses into a world long gone, yet never forgotten. Their tombs and the treasures within them provide an intimate connection to the past, one that transcends time and speaks to the enduring nature of human desire for immortality. While Henry VIII's legacy is etched in the annals of English history, the Egyptians left behind physical reminders of their belief in the afterlife symbols of immortality that continue to captivate us. Through archaeology, modern science, and cultural study, we continue to learn more about the ancient Egyptians' mummification techniques. Technologies like CT scans and 3D imaging have provided us with detailed insights into the lives of these ancient people, their medical practices, and their understanding of the body and death. In a way, we're continuing the legacy of the Egyptians, unraveling their secrets long after they've gone. This is something that Henry VIII's legacy, while monumental, cannot provide in the same way. His tomb, though historically significant, is a finite symbol of a man who reigned in a particular time, and whose power, though enduring in historical influence, did not transcend the material world in the same way the Egyptians envisioned. Historians still debate the motivations behind Henry's actions and how his legacy is remembered. Some view him as a visionary who created the conditions for the English Reformation and laid the groundwork for the modern British state. Others see him as a ruler driven by his desires and insecurities, whose actions caused great upheaval and chaos. But what we can all agree on is that Henry VIII's legacy is firmly rooted in the political changes he made during his reign, particularly in his break from Rome and his role in establishing Protestantism in England. The Egyptian approach to legacy, on the other hand, offers a timeless perspective, one that connects their understanding of life and death to the divine. Their desire for immortality was rooted in their belief that the soul was not bound to the constraints of earthly existence, but was part of an eternal divine order. This focus on continuity beyond death was not just a spiritual pursuit, but a cultural one. In their eyes, the body was the key to the soul's journey, and mummification was the sacred ritual that ensured a lasting connection to the gods. As we reflect on these two vastly different approaches to legacy, we are left with the understanding that death, no matter how we approach it, is a universal human concern. Whether we seek to leave behind a political dynasty as Henry VIII did, or we strive for spiritual immortality, as the Egyptians believed the desire to be remembered to live on beyond our mortal selves is one of the most profound human instincts. Perhaps in the end, that desire is what connects us all, from the pharaohs of ancient Egypt to the kings and queens of England, to the modern-day individuals who seek to leave their mark on the world. As we draw this exploration to a close, we're reminded that legacy is something we each define for ourselves. Whether through the material wealth we leave behind, the spiritual journey we embark upon, or the changes we make in the world, our legacy is a reflection of who we are. The Egyptians, through their mummies and tombs, sought a legacy that transcended time and death. Henry VIII, through his actions and his bloodline, sought a legacy of power, control, and continuity. And today we continue to search for meaning in the way we live, the choices we make, and the legacy we hope to leave behind. End of script. Sweet dreams.